Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Troyer, and I proudly serve as the Dean of the Belk College of Business here at UNC Charlotte. Welcome to the North Carolina Economic Forecast. So over the years, we've been thankful to our friends in the business community who've provided essential funding for this event, the research that underlies the presentation in particular. So sponsors help keep this quarterly event free and complimentary to students, alumni, the business community. So for sponsorship information, you can reach out to us at belkrsvp@charlotte.edu. If you have questions, please submit them via chat at any time during John's remarks, and we'll have a question and answer period immediately following the presentation. For those of you on Twitter, you can join today's presentation conversation by using hashtag NC Forecast. We look forward to seeing your tweets. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and our speaker, Dr. John Connaughton, Professor of Economics in the Belk College. John joined the Belk College faculty in 1978 and became the director of the North Carolina Economic Forecast in 1981. That was the first quarterly forecast was in 1982, 40 years ago. So for over 40 years, John has been interpreting the data and sharing his expertise on where North Carolina's economy has been and where it's going. So welcome, Dr. John Connaughton.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And let me go ahead and share my screen here, and I hope everybody can see it. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first quarter 2022 economic forecast. And let me tell you, things have changed dramatically since we last got together in December of 2021. We have a very busy card today. Let's go ahead and get right to it. First of all, this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to take a look at the virus 2 years on, and it's really been just about 2 years. I remember March 13th, the governor told us all to go home. And so it's basically 2 years and a couple of days. Then we're going to look at state recoveries, how the various states have handled the recovery during the last year or so. New topic that we weren't talking about very much 3 months ago, and now is the lead headline everywhere, and that's gas prices and the impact it's going to have on the economy going forward. Then we'll take a look at the outlook, or really kind of a recap of 2021 and 2022. And then we'll spend the remainder of the presentation talking about inflation, which seems to be the big bugaboo going forward. So the virus, 2 years on. So December 1st, 2019, the first case was reported. By December 8th, we had the first hospital case. There have been 455 million worldwide cases so far, 6.1 million worldwide deaths. In the United States, we've had 72 million cases in 2 years. And we've had 910,000 US deaths, almost a million, just under a million. What's interesting about this is when we look at the 7-day moving average of cases in the US over the past 2 years, we look at when we were all scared as all get out back here in March and April of 2020, when this first cropped up. And then we saw, of course, the winter peak during the holidays in 2020, November, December, January and February, and we thought that was pretty bad. Then we had Delta right here, and this is Omicron. And as you can see, it was clearly by twofold worse than when we had no vaccines. And in addition to that, all of this in terms of daily cases, 700,000 daily cases on average during the peak of Omicron, are much worse than when we first started out back in March and April of 2020. As far as the moving deaths are concerned, one of the things that's interesting, you can see the case rate, incredible, but the death rate, not as bad as it was in the fall of 20 and the winter of 21, and not as bad as it was, or just a little worse than it was during the very early days of the pandemic. So we've learned a lot in terms of being able to treat the cases, and I think that's an important thing going forward. The 7-day moving average in North Carolina, as you can see, pretty much the same pattern as the US. The winter peak wasn't nearly as bad here as it was in the US, but Omicron was pretty powerful. And the same thing when we look at the North Carolina counties that are most impacted by this. This basically ranks them from worst, all of the 20 worst counties in terms of cases per 100,000. So you've got McDowell County, half the people in the state have tested positive for COVID, and maybe more actually haven't. And you can see the state average is about 245 people per 1,000 population. Over here we have the death rate, and as you can see on the death rate here, the overall death rate per case is less than 1% in North Carolina, but we have a number of counties which have much higher death rates, almost triple, but clearly double in a lot of states that are double the death rate of the overall county, overall state. And the states, the counties least affected. All right, we've got again what's interesting is you have low populated rural counties that have the worst impacts and have the least impact. It's really kind of strange. And so when we're looking over here, again, we see some counties that are pretty close to half the case rate that the overall state has. And in terms of death, big disparity there, as you can see. We're looking at this, and the state death rate is just under 1% per case. But we've got Pitt County, Dare County, Franklin, Wake, all in the east part of the state that are pretty low in terms of death rates. And some of the bigger counties, Durham, Orange, Mecklenburg, Wake County, all because of good quality medical care, seem to have much lower death rates than the overall the overall North Carolina death rate. Going forward, we've been in recovery now since June of 2020. We had a 2-month recession. That's all, just 2 months. So we had March and April were the recession months of 2020, and by June the recovery began when the lockdowns tended to ease. And so we've had a year and a half essentially of recovery, and the states have experienced quite a bit different recoveries over that 2-year or 18-month period. So here we have the states with the weakest recoveries. Wyoming is still 6.7% below the 2019 fourth quarter through the 2021 third quarter. Again, Alaska, Hawaii, Louisiana. When we look at Hawaii, particularly it's a tourist destination state. Alaska and Wyoming, have not recovered very well. And they're energy producing states along with Louisiana and Oklahoma. So it's been very, very different in terms of what has caused this problem in terms of the slow recovery. On the other hand, we have a number of states that are doing gangbusters. I mean, here you've got New Hampshire, about 6.4% above where it was before this all began. That's over a 3% average growth rate through the years of COVID. Utah, Washington State, South Dakota, California is there. Again, a wide range of different size and different types of states with different economic structures. North Carolina has done fairly well, been averaging a little bit about 3% above where it was in 2019. Lowest state unemployment rates, we have Nebraska and Utah at 2.3%. You see North Carolina is about in the middle of the pack of states with a 4.1% rate. And the states that still have very, very high unemployment rates, DC, New Mexico, California, Alaska, have been slow to recover in terms of unemployment rates and producing jobs for folks. Overall, the U.S. rate is 3.9%. So we can take a look at those states. And again, it's a varied set of states. I mean, we got New Mexico and California. You could have two states that are different in terms of their economic structure. Alaska, different again. District of Columbia, different again. So it really is quite strange in terms of how states have performed during that recovery period. Some doing very well, some really struggling. The one last thing I want to talk about going forward is consumer confidence. And you can see that consumer confidence has been down from where it was earlier in 2021 when the virus seemed to be under control and everything seemed to be going good. And then we had the breakthrough cases in the summer and again in the fall with Omicron. And now we're looking at a consumer confidence number about 110, which is higher than what you would consider normal, which is about 90.90 on an index number. And so, consumers are still fairly confident, and that's very, very good going forward. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. All right, big thing that's been going on lately in the economy, really grabbing the headlines, has been energy prices. And there are two things here. And I want to try to spend some time just helping you understand the energy market. But there are a number of things that are unique to the energy industry, that I don't think get clearly spelled out when we try to help people understand what's going on and why this is important. All right, so let's start off with the following. The United States became a net annual petroleum exporter in 2020. That's the first time we've reached that mark, become an exporter since 1949. So that's 70 years. Also in 2020, the United States produced about 18 million barrels a day, and consumed about 18 million barrels a day. But what's interesting about that, and I think this is really important to understand, is, okay, somebody says, hey, we produce about as much energy as we consume, or it's very, very close. Why don't we just, worry about our country and not worry about the rest of the world? Well, it turns out, while we were a net exporter, we exported 8.5 million barrels, darn near half of the petroleum that we produced, we exported, and we imported about almost 8 million barrels of petroleum a day. So the petroleum market is really kind of strange. Just because you produce it doesn't mean that's what you are consuming. A lot of folks think oil is homogeneous, and it's not. It's very heterogeneous. You've got, West Texas sweet crude, light crude, which is, just the nicest thing you could ever do. Refineries love it. It's easy to do. And then you got Venezuelan oil, which is essentially mud and actually heavier than water and sinks. So you've got a vast array of oil types, and you've got a vast array of oil consumption patterns. And just because you produce it doesn't mean it's what you need to use in your country. So the oil market is really a world energy market, with oil moving across borders, even if countries are net exporters or net importers. All right. Let's take a look at U.S. petroleum. I think the biggest thing to also understand is there's a difference between petroleum and oil. Oil is a subset of petroleum, and here we have U.S. petroleum production. 67, or 2/3 basically, is crude oil, and about 1/3 is hydrocarbon gases and liquids. Okay, and so that's the breakdown. So this is what you think of as oil, and this is natural gas and some other lightweight energy products. In terms of crude oil, what we produce with it, about 51% of it, of the petroleum, winds up coming from crude oil and winds up being finished motor gasoline. About 29% is hydrocarbon gas liquids, and another 20% is other things like benzene, kerosene, JP4 jet fuel, etc. So these are the really light stuff that is at the top of the refining process. All right, so here is 2021. Remember, we were a net exporter in 2020. Well, by 2021, we became a net importer. This is what we produce, about 18.6, not all that much different from what we 18.6 million barrels, not all that much different from what we produced in 2020, but supplied, and that's a term that the energy agencies use. It really means consumed. We consumed about almost 20 million barrels. So we're a net importer of a little over 1 million barrels of petroleum in 2021. What's interesting here is we produced a lot of gasoline and we consumed not as much gasoline, so we're a net exporter of gasoline. And that's got basically to do with the types of cars that we have in America, mainly gasoline powered versus diesel, and what goes on in Europe, where you have mostly diesel cars. And so they ship us gasoline, we ship them diesel fuel, and as it turns out, we ship them more diesel fuel than they ship us gasoline. So it winds up being we're a net exporter of finished motor gasoline, which includes diesel. And then hydrocarbon liquids, which is liquefied natural gas, again, big exporter of that in recent years. All right, so here's the one you all wanted to look at. This is the last year and change, couple of months of gas prices, starting back in January of 2021, with U.S. average for all blends of regular gas was $2.42 for the month, average for the month. By the end of the year, by January, it had risen to $3.61. In the last couple of weeks, it's popped up to over 425, 432. This is what it was at the end of last week. It's come down a little bit since then. All right. So you start to see that, and of course, that's what gotten everybody's attention. But I said, wait a minute, is this really as bad as it seems? And so what I did was I went back and I looked at gas prices all the way back to 1929. And everybody's going to say, oh, yeah, that was when it was a nickel a gallon. No, not really. So I got 92 or 93 years of historic gasoline prices nominally, and then I adjusted them for inflation. And what you see there is kind of interesting. I adjusted them for 2021 prices. So here's the nominal number that starts back here when it was 18, 19 cents a gallon back in 1929. I remember that, by the way. I just thought I'd throw that out. And then you can see it rises steadily, and we've got some peaks and valleys here. And then in the last couple of years, it pops, or the last year, it pops up pretty significantly. But when you adjust it and express all of these nominal prices, all these years in real 2021 dollars, this is the red line that you see. And you all of a sudden realize, you know what? The 92-year average real price is $2.93. So it's like normal is a $3 gallon of gasoline. So when we look back here last year, this is abnormal. This is below normal. This is in the normal range right here. And now in the last couple of weeks, last couple of months, I should say, we popped up above what we would expect. And of course, this is the last one here we've had. This is the last year in 2 months where it's popped up considerably. But it's still in real terms not as high as it was just before the Great Recession. All righty. So here's some interesting facts. All right, this is daily consumption of gasoline in gallons, and this is in barrels, 42 gallons in a barrel. But what I did was I said, okay, if gas goes up by 50 cents, how much money does going to the pump and filling your tank up cost out of Americans' pockets? It's almost $62 billion. Now, if you think about this, and we've had 3 50-cent increases over the past year, you multiply that 3, and it's almost $200 billion out of consumers' pockets that going into the gas pump that's not going into someplace else, going out to eat, buying clothing, taking a vacation, food at the supermarket, etc. These are all things that you can't spend that $200 billion on. More importantly, there are other uses of oil, and in barrel sense, it's more than what we use and for gasoline. That takes another every 50 cents, 89 billion. The total is 151 billion. So when energy goes up and gas goes up by 50 cents, all the rest of the energy goes up together because it's all based on oil. And if you take the $1.50 increase and you multiply this 151 billion number by 3, you get $450 billion. That's a chunk of change. All right, that's a couple of percent, 2.5% of GDP. So that's a real big hit in terms of the money that's been taken out of the pockets of American consumers, whether they are buying gasoline at the gas pump, heating their home with natural gas or oil, or whether or not they're paying more for a variety of products that are shipped and therefore are costing more to move around the country. As a rule, as a kind of a guideline, for every $10 increase in the price of a barrel of oil, okay, it basically puts 24 cents into the price of a gallon of gasoline. So that's a way you can figure it. So interestingly enough, we've seen energy or oil prices go up in the last week up to one day it was $130, but we're now back to about $100. So you start to see that $100 barrel is probably going to reduce the price of gasoline back somewhere close to $4 or less in the next several weeks. One other little comment about oil prices. When you see them say oil today is $102 or it's at $98, those are actually future contracts. So it's actually oil about 2 months in the future. It's not the spot price. Spot price isn't that much different typically, but it could be a little bit different. Okay. All right, so here we go. World daily production in 2021. The United States produces 18 million. We're the #1 producer of petroleum in the world by far. Saudi Arabia is next, Russia's third, Canada's fourth. You take a look at the United States, Canada, and we get down here to Mexico with just under 2 million barrels. And you add that together, and in North America, we produce probably pretty close to 27, 28% of the world's petroleum just in the 3 countries in North America. The problem here, and again, 18 million barrels out of 93 million. OPEC, the oil producing and exporting countries, basically account for 36% of production, 33 million barrels a day. If you're talking about somehow or other embargoing Russian oil, they produce 10 million barrels, they export about 5 million barrels, which is about 5.3% of the world's supply. And you can see where the problem comes. Where are you going to replace 5 million barrels out of this list? And I think that's the problem. This is a little bit different here. This is crude oil production, but it's pretty much the same story. All right. And I just go back here for a second. Somebody might say, well, you're producing 18 million barrels a day and you're consuming pretty close to 18 million barrels a day. That's roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. We have a problem here. We're kind of greedy. Well, I like to, because we only have 300 million people, about 5% of the world's population, but we're consuming about 20% of the world's energy, or at least oil or petroleum. But here's the thing. Yeah, we consume 20% of the world's petroleum, but we also produce 25% of the world's GDP. So from a production standpoint, we're actually fairly efficient in our oil usage. Okay, so top 5 sources of U.S. crude imports as a share of total crude imports. So this is all the imports equals 100%. As you can see, Canada and Mexico make up over 70% of where we get our imported oil from. So we get it from our neighbors. Canada's the big one, Mexico second, then Saudi Arabia third. And this is where we send our crude oil: China, Canada, the Netherlands, India, and South Korea. But it's a big, very open market. All right. Just so everybody can remind, we have a lot of younger folks that are watching this presentation. I thought I'd remind you of what things were like in 1974, the last time we had sort of an energy crisis. And these are the gas lines in the winter of 73, 74. I can tell it's 73, 74 for 2 reasons. One, you can sort of pick out some of the cars. Here's a Mustang. Here's a Ford Pinto before it exploded. That's a joke. And it's all in black and white, as you can see. And here's a cutter right here. We got to worry about that. See that line right there? This gentleman or lady is cutting in right there. That's probably a problem. All right, one last thing about what happened in 1974, which a lot of you don't remember. U.S. national speed limit, 55 miles an hour from 1974 to 1995. And it was put in to conserve gasoline. Just keep that in mind, because we have speed limits now in the United States. North Carolina, the top speed limit is 70. You move a little further west, you start to see 75 on a regular basis. And there are some states that have 80 or even 85 mile an hour speed limits out west. So yeah, it's a big change, and 21 years of a national 55 mile an hour speed limit. All right, let's take a look at the North Carolina economy in 2021. This is kind of the pattern that we saw during the year. And as you can see, start off the year great, 9.8%. Overall growth for the state in 2021, 6.7%. We still don't have the final numbers in on the 4th quarter, so this is an estimate. Started the year off great, 9.8%. I mean, that's a big number. 6% in the 2nd quarter. And then the 3rd quarter, like the US, we had a down quarter because we had a lot of quarantine and shutdowns again because of what was taking place with Delta and the concern that it had. The expectation is we'll have a 4th quarter just under 6%. And quite frankly, that should end the 5 and 6% growth rate quarters going forward as we start to adjust to a more normal pattern in the years going forward. All right. This is a sector by sector breakdown. For those that are viewing this presentation for the first time, let me give you a brief understanding of how to interpret this. The horizontal axis, which generated by these numbers over here, so we take durable goods manufacturing, 12.3%. That horizontal line is essentially the growth rate of that sector during 2021. So durables grew by 12.3% compared to the overall growth rate of 6.7%. Okay, business and professional services, 12.8%. Information was 14.5%, and so on. That's the horizontal. The vertical axis here, this is the percent of total GDP that each sector accounts for. essentially you add this up, it's 100%. And this is sort of like a pie chart, but it's not a pie. What you can do with this is if you look at the height of it, the growth rate, times the percent of the GDP that it makes up of the state's output, the area of that of that rectangle essentially gives you a sense as to how important that one sector was to the overall growth rate. Big boxes had a big impact on producing this 6.7%. Little boxes really didn't have much impact at all. So as you can see here, durable goods manufacturing, important, information important, business and professional services was important. Again, these are pretty large sectors and had some pretty significant growth rates. From the job standpoint, we added 143,500 net jobs. And remember, lost over almost 300,000 jobs at the peak of the downturn. We've been adding them back steadily since then, but 143,500 jobs, pretty big number. Overall employment growth grew by 3.2% from December of 2020 to December of 2021. This is the first full year, or 2021 is the first full year of recovery. We had a half a year in 2020. And you can see again here, hospitality and leisure services had the biggest increase in employment, 11.3%. Those are the service industries, restaurants, hotels, etc. Those are the ones hardest hit, lost the most jobs, and those are the ones that are recovering and putting jobs back in. 143.5, pretty good number. Looking forward into 2022, things are not going to be quite as robust as they were in 2020. We're expecting about a 3.1%. That's pretty much back to normal before this all began. In 2018 and 2019, we were right around a 3% growth rate for the year. And you can see that we're starting to see some tapering off in terms of the GDP per quarters and each individual quarters in terms of their growth rates. But a fairly stable year, but not the kind of robust quarterly growth that we experienced in the second half of 2020 and in 2021. As far as sectors that are going to do fairly well, again, hospitality and leisure services, business and professional services, information, manufacturing sectors, which grew pretty well in the 21, are going to be back to their kind of normal position. One of the interesting ones is retail trade, which we actually think is going to decline, which is a pretty significant sector, but that's got more to do with some secular issues about long-term trends in brick and mortar versus online ordering. And so we don't, and again, a lot of supply, because remember, in retail trade are new car dealerships. And of course, they're not going to sell very many cars in 2022 because the chip shortage is continuing to be problematic. And we're seeing Ford and Tesla, et cetera, closing down assembly lines for weeks at a time because they simply cannot get the inputs they need. On unemployment, we're going to again create a lot of jobs, 124,400 net jobs. The big gain sectors are going to be hospitality and leisure and other services, and also information. We're going to see some significant job gains in those sectors. Okay, so at the end of all of this, we're looking at about GDP being about 5.1% higher at the end of 21 than at the end of 19. It's about 2.5% growth per year. We're down a few jobs, 31,000 compared to where we were in December of 2019. And the unemployment rate is about 0.6% higher, 4.1 versus 3.5. So all in all, most of where we were in 2019, we've gotten back or gotten pretty close to back. Okay, so now it's time for organic growth in the economy to take over. And that's what's really going to, what we're going to see going forward. All right. All right. So going forward in 2022, there are some things that I am concerned about. There's some known knowns that could make this not as good as what we've suggested. How long the continuing supply chain issues become a problem. Obviously, inflation is starting to come up and become an ever increasing problem as it takes money out of consumer pockets. We've seen what's happening, and when you've got a basic fundamental problem. You live where you live, you work where you work, and you drive what you drive. And as a result of that, you have very little price elasticity, very inelastic for gasoline. And so when the price goes up, you basically have to pay that. and that comes out of other types of spending that you could do, and that's problematic going forward into 2022. Finally, we've got deficit spending. We know we've had problems in the past. We just passed an omnibus bill, $1.5 trillion to fund the government through the end of September. The problem with that is it is going to add about $250 to $300 billion to deficit again. It's basically unknown how that's going to, I mean, it's known that that's going to be a problem, but it's not clear how big of a problem it is going forward. The known unknowns, Omicron, and maybe an Omicron BA whatever variant, or some other variant that gets another Greek letter name, and the problems it caused. We're starting to see some of that take place now. We're seeing China starting to lock down some cities and close plants as they're starting to see surges in Omicron variant. The other known unknown that we've got is Ukraine. We don't know where that's going and how involved the US will be. And we'll talk about this a little bit later when we deal with inflation. We've got the Fed tapering in the bond market. They're not quite done yet, but they're pretty close. And of course, today is the second day of the March Fed meeting. They're done with their meeting, and at 2 o'clock, they're going to announce what they've decided to do with Fed interest rate policy. Before Ukraine, we were talking about a 50 basis point increase today, and maybe another 4 or 5 quarter point or 25 basis point increases during the rest of the year. Now we're probably back to a 25 basis point rate increase today, and maybe 2, maximum 3 other rate increases during the year. So we don't know what the Fed is going to do going forward. And that, again, is problematic in terms of trying to take a look at what's going to happen in 2022. So when we look at the 3.1% growth, that's really the most optimistic outlook. Any of these go in the wrong direction, and it could become a problem for that growth rate going forward. All right, here's the state and national unemployment rate. Here's the US unemployment rate in blue, state unemployment rate in green, and then the forecast. We expect to be just below 4% by the end of this year. Probably 3.8 or 3.9 by December of 2022. Okay, now the big one, the big 800-pound gorilla in the room, inflation. This is an insidious tax on all of us. And you know, there are just a lot of things going on, so let's take a look at them. Okay, too much information on this chart. I apologize. What I want you to do, this is the consumer price index on a monthly basis, 2020, 2021, and the first couple of months of 2022. All right. First thing I want you to do is focus on the blue bars. All right. The blue bar is the annual increase. And what we mean by that is, so for example, the most recent one was just released last week. It's February of 2022 compared to February of 2021, what prices were. And we saw that there was a 7.9% increase in prices over the year from February of 21 to February of 22. And we can see that through 20, the blue was all in the between 0 and 2% range. And then in the spring of 2021, we start to see it rising each and every month, kind of levels off in the summer, and then it's been rising again. Okay, we'll talk about why that pattern has emerged. Okay, this is basically demand pull inflation, too many dollars chasing too few goods. It's kind of a relaxation in the summer, and then we've seen this spike here take place primarily because of cost push inflation, which is, you know, getting resources to produce goods costing more. The problem with the blue number is it's kind of ancient history. It's telling us, oh, okay, this is how much prices rose over the last year. So what I like to look at is what this red line, which is the monthly annualized increase. Now the month-to-month increase, so this red line right here with 11.5% is telling us how the price in February of 22 compared to prices in January of 22. So it's just a 1 month increase. But the 1 month increase is very small. It's 0.085 or something like that percent. It's a very, very small rate because it's just 1 month. But if you annualize that rate, in other words, say, okay, what if this with a rate continued for the next 11 months? What would it be over a 12-month period? And that's where you get the 11.5% rate. So what I like to, the way I like to think about this is the blue is the history. The red is kind of a predictor of where we're headed, because it's the most recent piece of information. And as you can see, The blue is not going in the right direction, as you can see, it's rising, but the red is even worse, telling us that we're having, the last 2 months, we've actually had significant increases month to month, December to January and January to February. Okay. This index over here is the producer prices. Same thing. The blue line is the annual increase. The red is the monthly annualized increase. And again, you can see the pattern, same similar pattern. This is what these are essentially, if you think of it, wholesale prices. All right. In the February inflation by categories, overall, 7.9% annual increase. Food was basically average, but here are the ones that were above average that were basically pushing everything. Energy, gasoline, new vehicles, used vehicles off the wall, off the chart here, and airline fares. These are the categories that are pushing overall inflation. And you can see the percentage of the total index that they make up here. These ones that are very, very high are making up about 20%, just under 20% of the total of all items in the market basket are being shopped for. So these things are what are pushing this 7.9%. Just by way of a little history, this is what the 70s looked like. The average annual rates of inflation during the 70s. We had 1, 2, 3 years of double-digit inflation during the 70s. In 1977, in response to what was going on, the Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act and authorized, if you will, what we now effectively call the dual mandate to promote the goals of maximum employment and stable prices. So they have a dual mandate of maximum employment or maximum GDP, but yet stable prices as well. And as an editorial here, I'll just simply say that this has done well for us. This 77 Act, the Federal Reserve Act, has done well for us over the past 50 years or so, and has been a guiding force for the Federal Reserve. But in the last decade, we seem to have lost our way, and we're starting to do a lot of things similar to what we experienced in the 70s in terms of what we've been paying attention to, less about stable prices and more about other issues. And that is a concern going forward. Okay, so types of inflation. Well, we've got demand pull. I talked about that earlier. That's when demand for output exceeds what the economy can produce. Buyers bid the price up. And we've had stimulus checks and government spending really pretty heavily in the last year and a half. Cost push, that's where prices are pushed up by increases in costs, availability, things like chips, availability, also increase in the price of oil. It permeates throughout the entire economy. And we've also had some work disincentives that make wages go up and push up the cost of production on companies. Here's the kind of the COVID-19 funding that we had between March 2020 and February 2021, 11 months. We authorized $6.1 trillion of stimulus spending. Put this in perspective, in the Great Recession, which lasted 18 months, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that was passed in February of 2009, or 2009, I'll get it out here, was only $787 billion. Earlier than that, a couple of months before, we passed the TARP Act, which was $750 billion. But remember, all of that ultimately got paid back, plus $20 billion in interest. So you can compare this as 8 to 9 times the stimulus that we saw in the Great Recession of 2007, 8, and 9. Recently, we just passed another $1 trillion in the infrastructure bill in September of 21 for a total of 7.1 trillion. This is what the average, 2 adults, 1 child family got, $8,900 of after-tax money in less than a year. And as a result of that, about 80% of the households were eligible to receive this money. And that's kind of where we had that big demand pull in the spring, first quarter and a half of 2021. And you can see here in quarter 1 and quarter 2 of 2021, when you look at the annual increases in GDP of 10.9% and 13.4%, but we had annual increases of 15.7 and 19.3 in personal consumption. You can see that consumers are increasing the demand faster than we're increasing output, and that's classic demand pull inflation. We also saw that in Q3 of 2020. All right, so 70 inflation pressures. We had a bunch of new domestic programs: war on poverty in the 60s, Medicare, Medicaid, aid to families with dependent children, food stamps, and 12 more programs were passed as part of the Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program in 1965. We had the Vietnam War, and then we also had the Nixon pulling us off the gold standard in 1971. All of these were demand pull inflationary items that caused that incredible increase that we saw during the 70s. We also had 2 gas shortages, which produced gas lines in 73, 74, and again in 79. Today, we have significant domestic spending. I just documented $6.1 trillion of stimulus, and $9,000 to the average family in stimulus checks over the past year. We've experienced enhanced unemployment payments, payroll protection plans, child care credits up until December, where we were handing money out or mailing checks every week. And then SNAP benefit upgrade. Now, SNAP program is a supplemental nutritional program. Used to be called food stamps. What they did was they increased the calorie content in the mix of calories in the plan, and that automatically, because of costs, increased the amount that not checks, but the amount that the cards would have on them to buy food. Okay, so today's inflationary pressures on the cost push side. We've got declining labor force participation rates because of baby boomers entering retiring age and those who are following them entering the labor force, 16 to 19-year-olds. That's a smaller group of people than the 60 to 65-year-olds that are retiring. We have extended supply chains that have been disrupted for a variety of reasons, which cause shortages from time to time. Expanded regulations have been put in. We have COVID issues, and who knows when the next soft lockdown is going to be, when the next variant's going to come along. And finally, the kicker on the top of all of this is we've seen oil prices go up considerably in the last couple of months. The good news is in the last week, they've come down significantly, but they're still hovering around $100, and $100 is pushing a $4 a gallon price of gasoline. I get that out. And finally, I said the Fed is meeting today. And John Taylor produced what he called the Taylor Rule back in 1993, a few years ago. And it's not a rule to determine it's not a rule the Fed should use to determine what the federal funds rate is, but it's a way of being able to check the federal funds rate. And so the current federal funds rate, I'm going to say right now, is 25 basis points. I'm going to say they raised it a quarter, and as soon as we're done here, we'll hear about that. The problem is the Taylor Rule today estimates the federal funds rate should be 3.5%. Now, at a quarter percent and an 8% rate of inflation, all right, what we're looking at here is essentially a negative interest rate of north of 7.5%, real interest rate, negative real interest rate. So the Taylor Rule would tell the Fed that at the minimum, we should be looking at 3.5% for the federal funds rate today. And as you can see, we're quite a ways away from that. So going forward, a little bit disconcerting about what the Fed is going to do. I'm not sure they're going to be serious enough about inflation in 2022. I think recently the uncertainty that surrounds Ukraine has caused them again to walk things back. I provided the rule that was passed in 1977 that created the dual mandate. And both of those were supposed to have equal weight. But in recent years, I'd say the last decade and change, the Fed has taken on the first, and that is GDP growth and maximum employment, as being the much more important rule, not stable prices. And ultimately, stable prices or unstable prices, inflation 7, 8, 9, 10% potentially, it will be the downfall of this economy. I didn't tell you what happened when we finally decided to get our handle on inflation, and in the 1970s, and I'll kind of bring that out right now. So Paul Volcker, two things I'm going to say, and I'm probably going to get get negative feedback for this, but I'm going to say it anyway. In 1970s was the last time we had a Fed chair that was an economist. We have a Fed chair today that is not an economist. Just saying. At the end of the 70s, Paul Volcker took over, and he was an economist, and he clamped down and basically took about 4 or 5 years to really get inflation under control. But the upshot of that was his monetary policy was so strict and so dramatic that mortgage rates in 1980 rose to almost 20%. 19.5% was the highest mortgage rates that I saw in 1980. And that really generated a 1980 recession, soon followed by a 1982 recession. So we got two recessions to basically curb inflation. And it really didn't get curbed until about 1985 and 2 recessions later. So that's just something to keep in mind going forward. At some point in time, we're going to have to get serious about inflation. All right. And, kind of the last bad news of the slide, this is the Federal Reserve balanced budget. I mean, excuse me, Federal Reserve, balance sheet. Back before the Great Recession, it was less than $1 trillion. You can see QE1, QE2, QE3. They didn't really taper when they got up to $4.5 trillion in the balance sheet. They just let some things mature. And they were going down. We got to about 3.7 trillion. And then COVID came along, and as we say, bada bing, bada boom. But what's really scary is between the last time we met and today, or March 9th, which is the last data point I have, we've added about $260 billion to the Fed balance sheet, i.e. they've bought $260 billion of accommodated debt to keep interest rates low, while inflation is running at 7 to 8%. Okay. All right. So keys to watch going forward, a little over, but COVID-19 spike, new variant, something that's really interesting and something we should pay attention to and its effect on the economy. The Fed tapering and their interest rate policy going forward. These two things, along with oil prices, are really going to be the 3 guiding factors. Ukraine is the great unknown, I guess, and known unknown. We don't know how that's going to affect, but it's going to be problematic, I think, going forward. But I'm not an expert, and I don't know how it's going to affect our economy at this point in time. It's one of these exogenous shocks that flies in and hits you, and it'll take a time to figure us out. Take a time for us to figure it out. The March inflation number will come out. Or CPI number will come out on April 12th. The Federal Open Market Committee meets again in March 15th and 16th. That's today. We'll get the number this afternoon. The next consumer confidence number, which I suspect will be down after the invasion, we've got to get it on March 29th. U.S. monthly job growth will be the first Friday. So we'll get the March number the first Friday in April. And then the first quarter GDP, which will give us a good idea of what's going on, will be April 28th. And, best case scenario is 3% growth. But these things up here, these top 4 things could put a hit on that. Okay. I want to thank you for attending, and now I'll be happy to invite Jennifer back to help us to help me take questions going forward. Thank you.
All right, thank you, John. So as John said, we're moving on to the Q&A portion. We have received several questions so far, but if you have questions, just a reminder, you can put them in the chat and we'll get to as many of them as possible in the next 10 minutes. So John, a few questions about the labor force and staffing in particular. So the first one is really kind of a sort of a comment and then a question. We've got one of the individuals who is participating today was talking about the temp penetration rate, which apparently is at a US all-time high of 2.09%, which means employers need workers. And also said, what's your opinion about how wage increases for entry-level workers closer to the $15 level, what effect has that had on inflation?
Well, it's funny, okay? I think 2 years ago, there was a big talk about moving the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15. $15 is ancient history as a minimum wage. I don't know of anyone anywhere that's getting less than $15, and I think most are getting significantly more. I'm not sure that anyone who's in the food service industry in the hospitality industry is able to hire anyone for $15. I think we're all pushing high teens, if not $20 an hour to get people to work. There are two things going on that one will resolve itself going forward, another will not. Okay. One that will resolve itself is that we'll start to get into balance in terms of what we produce and what we can consume. And that's going to happen in 2022, and that's going to take some pressure. We're not, we're going to spend out that $9,000 we got. Okay, we're spending it out, and when it's spent out, we're going to have to live within our means, and that's going to put less pressure on businesses to produce. Restaurants will have a little bit less traffic. They may be able to match the workers to the traffic they have, etc. And as people's savings get run down, people will be more willing to take jobs than they are right now. That's going to ease itself over the next year, I believe. But there's one component that's not going to change, and that is this problem that we have with the baby boomers retiring and the group that's coming in to backfill them in the labor force being smaller than the baby boomers. Jennifer, I look at that chart in the 1970s, and I'm reminded of a lot of what caused that was an inability to understand what was generating the problem during that time. The Fed was looking at high unemployment rates and thinking, well, this is a problem, we've got to juice the economy. But the high unemployment rates were being brought about by the baby boomers entering the labor force and increases in female labor force participation rates in the 70s. And there were years in the 70s when labor force was growing by 3.5%. You put 3.5% together with 2% productivity gain, economy has to grow at 5.5% to keep the unemployment rate constant. You can do that for a year or so, but after that, it can't. And so it was false policy to try to stimulate the economy with money to try to bring that unemployment rate down, which was being caused by the baby boomers. And now we're seeing the baby boomers again causing some problems as well as they begin to retire. There's such a big group that when they start to do something, it overweights what's going on average in the economy. So, that I don't think is going away anytime soon. I've talked about this before. I think we're looking at this for a decade or so.
Got it. A question about the unemployment rate. This individual asks, why are you thinking that it'll remain constant around 3.8 to 4? And this person is saying it's going to be lower. It's going to be 3.0 in North Carolina.
No, I don't think so. We've had the lowest I've seen the rate in North Carolina is about 3.5%. And when I say this, it may, to some it may seem harsh, but a 4% rate of unemployment, you have to understand that there's a mismatch in jobs and workers. It's called frictional unemployment, and it is that mismatch in the inefficiencies in the labor market to instantaneously match workers and jobs. And we believe that mismatch, that base, if you will, we call it benchmark unemployment, is somewhere around 4%. We've felt this way for years. And when you start pushing unemployment rates much below that 4%, that's when you start putting heavy pressure on wage inflation. And that becomes a spiral. So 4% is a really good target for us to be looking at. And for all intents and purposes, the US and North Carolina, we are at what we would consider to be full employment today.
So what's the risk of a recession?
Yeah, I'm afraid you're going to ask me that. I was kind of avoiding that because, the number one rule of economic forecasting is to give people a number and a date. Just don't give them at the same time.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So,
I've got more questions, John.
Yeah, no, I'll throw it out. I think that, one of the things that we should think about is prior to the Ukrainian invasion, we were looking at potentially a recession in 2023 because there was a belief the Fed was simply not going to get inflation under control soon enough and was going to have to do some serious constraints, if you will, in terms of monetary policy, and that would throw us in a recession. I'm not sure that they're ready to do that at this point in time. So I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a significant slowdown in late 2022, early 23.
Okay. Okay. So there've been calls to suspend the gas tax.
Yes,
Yes. Would that make any dent at all?
it would make a dent in your pocketbook for sure. You'd have a little more money to spend, but we have to remember what the gas tax is about. So two things: we got about an 19 cent federal tax, and there's also almost double that state tax in North Carolina, and other states are much higher than that. That money goes into a highway trust fund, and it produces, are you ready for this? The highways we drive on. It fixes the highways we drive on. You don't collect that money, it's not fungible. You can't get that money anywhere else. So there'll be no new roads, and we won't be fixing the potholes. More importantly, and this is certainly local to North Carolina and into Charlotte specifically, a nickel of that 18 cents goes into urban mass transit. And Charlotte is in the process of planning another rail line. Now, you can argue whether you want to do that or not want to do that, but suspending the gas tax is going to push that further back down the road. And from an environmental standpoint, that's probably not the best idea of pushing that off further and further. So I don't know how 18 cents, because I don't think you're going to get it at the state level. I don't know how 18 cents at the federal level is going to be a big deal. Interestingly enough, in that slide that I presented with the gas price, there was a little dip there in the early fall of 2021 in gas prices. And that was when Mr. Biden opened up the strategic oil reserves at the beginning of the price spike in gasoline. It lasted for a little while, and then, as you know, that was at $3.50, and now it's over $4. So it has a temporary effect, but honestly, it creates more problems down the road. Just like when we had the 2-year Social Security tax holiday, all that did was push forward how soon Social Security will run out of money.
Housing.
Housing.
Real estate. So, so what can you tell us about what you anticipate in terms of the housing market?
It is absolutely crazy right now. It's crazier today than it was a year ago, and it was crazy a year ago. And it's caused by two things. One, we still have relatively low interest rates. Mortgage rates from it, yeah, they're not as good as they were a year ago or 6 months ago, but they're still historically very low. So interest rates are still pretty attractive in the home buying business or arena. Secondly, no matter how we cut it, we simply have not been building houses. And so, population is growing. You take cities like Charlotte, Atlanta, Austin, Texas, etc. We are increasing, those cities are growing and growing and growing, but we're not building new houses. And so we're seeing these cities have massive supply shortages of houses, which is driving up the price of used houses considerably. And we've seen, as much as it increased in 2021, I think we'll see those equally in 2022, at least locally. I don't think it will abate until we have a recession. I think that's think about it. We got a 4.1% unemployment rate in the state, 3.9 nationally. People have jobs, and they're going to where the jobs are, but there aren't the houses there. So, yeah. So,
so from 1980 to 2020, we saw the 10-year treasury rates fall from like mid-teens to, 0.5%, the bottom. And, do you have any thoughts on what we can expect in terms of interest rates?
Well, we'll have a better idea in about 1 hour when the Fed announces what they're doing now. But all the expectations are that it's only going to be 25 basis points. I don't think we're going to see more than 150 basis points this year. I'd be surprised if it's over 100 basis points. In other words, we take a look in the fall, maybe in September or in the December forecast. We're not looking at federal funds rate at 1%, which is still far below where the Taylor rule would suggest it should be. And this is problematic because we're not going to get a handle on inflation. You can't solve inflation by talking about it. You have to have contractionary monetary policy. It's the only way. And the only way we're going to see this inflation problem go away is to essentially see the interest rates rise to where we have positive real rates. And a positive real rate right now is north of 7%.
Mhm. Okay. All right, last
Sorry.
question, John. Although we have more questions, but we're going with one more here before we wrap up for the lunch hour. So this person refers to Ray Dalio's book, Changing World Order, but the question is really about the reserve currency. So, what are your thoughts about, the Saudis talking to China about accepting yuan instead of dollars for Chinese oil sales? Is that, do we think we'll see a difference in the US dollar's prominence as the?
Well, Jennifer, you and I talked about this earlier. And for all the audience, Jennifer's an economist, okay? Guilty as charged. And so we talk about economic things. And this is starting to become a real problem. One of the reasons that Volcker did what he did back in '79 was a concern about the dollar's value and its ability to buy products, because the dollar, most international trade is denominated in US dollars. We need a stable US dollar. It is absolutely essential. Yeah, we look at inflation as being problematic for us as consumers, but it is also problematic as it relates to international transactions. We don't need to have a battle for reserve currencies. This will not end well, and it will definitely not. It'll be problematic if we start seeing the Chinese yuan become a more accepted reserve currency. So yeah, we need people at the Fed who are going to do the business of maintaining dollar value, not necessarily strength. I don't care. I don't think we care what it trades for against a euro or against a yuan. We just want a stable currency that trades at that rate consistently. And I think that's the key right there. And inflation is what erodes that. Inflation is bad, Jennifer. Very,
I know,
very bad.
I hear you, John. You don't have to tell me, like you said, I'm an economist. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you for today. And thanks to all of you for joining us for the North Carolina Economic Forecast. So please save the date, make plans to join us for the next forecast and the release of the second quarter report on Thursday, May 19th. So we are hoping to return to the Dubois Center Uptown soon. So please check the website for more information as we get closer. To help us as we plan for future Belk College events and to be entered for a chance to win a Belk College gift pack, please complete a brief survey. So you can scan this QR code here on the screen, and that'll take you to the survey. And this concludes the program today. So I will see you again in May.